scripture reading is kind of a backdrop to everything that's going on, and it's kind of the story of our song. But in leading up to it, the backstory of it is that the Israelites had gone to Israel, or to Egypt, because Joseph had been there. If you all remember the story of Joseph, it's been told many different ways. But they went to seek refuge there because there had been a great drought in the land. While they were there, because Joseph was close to Pharaoh and Pharaoh listened to Joseph interpret dreams, the Israelites grew in power. They grew in power and they grew in numbers, and eventually Joseph and the Pharaoh both died. And the new Pharaoh's looking around, looking at the numbers of Israelites and feeling threatened. So he tried everything to get rid of them: forced labor, killing firstborns. And when it came to that, there were two women, Shiphrah and Puah, who were Egyptian midwives, who saved the babies. And when Pharaoh came and said, why are the Israelites still multiplying? They told him, well, those Hebrew women are so hardy and so husky. They give birth before we can get there. And that's how they were saved. So Moses was saved, and a lot of us know the story of how Moses was hidden in a basket. But now we are going to pick up the rest of the story.
Our readers can come forward. Come on up. A reading from Exodus chapter 1 and chapter 3.
Now a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. He said to his people,
"Look, the Israelite people are more numerous and more powerful than we. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them. Or they will increase, and in the event of war, our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land."
Therefore they set taskmasters over them to oppress them with forced labor. They built supply cities, Pithom and Ramses, for Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread. So the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites. The Egyptians became ruthless in imposing tasks on the Israelites and made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick and every kind of field labor. They were ruthless in all the tasks they imposed on them. Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian. He led his flock beyond the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of a bush. He looked, and the bush was blazing, yet it was not consumed. Then Moses said,
"I must turn aside and look at this great sight and see why the bush is not burned up."
When the Lord saw that he had turned aside to see him, God called to him out of the bush.
Moses, Moses.
And
Here I am.
Come no closer. Remove the sandals from your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob.
And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look to God. And then the Lord said,
I have observed the misery of my people who are in Egypt. I have heard their cry on account of their taskmasters. Indeed, I know their sufferings, and I have come down to deliver them from the Egyptians and to bring them up out of the land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the country of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. The cry of the Israelites has now come to me. I have also seen how the Egyptians oppress them. So come, I will send you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt.
But Moses said to God,
Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt?
I will be with you, and this shall be the sign for you, that it is I who sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall worship God on this mountain.
But Moses said to God,
If I come to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your ancestors has sent me to you, and they ask me, what is his name? What shall I say to them?
God said to Moses,
I am who I am. Thus you shall say to the Israelites, I am has sent me to you. Thus you shall say to the Israelites, the Lord, the God of your ancestors, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and this my title for all generations.
The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Please pray with me. God, may the words on my lips and the meditations of my heart be pleasing in your sight. Amen. So, here we are in our 4th week of the Law and Order series, and we finally have a real criminal. Or do we? This person, is he any more of a criminal than this person? Or this person? Or this person? Let's take a closer look at the stories and see. Following the death of Joseph and the Pharaoh that Joseph had served, the Israelites continued to grow in number. Pharaoh tried oppressing them, but they seemed to multiply in greater numbers. Pharaoh then ordered midwives to kill all the males, yet they survived. Moses had been hidden in the weeds and then discovered by Pharaoh's daughter. When he was discovered, Moses had grown up in a life of relative luxury, raised in the household of Pharaoh's daughter, who had saved him as a baby. Yet Moses knew his heritage. He knew that he was Hebrew. One day when he was out walking, he saw an Egyptian beating up on a Hebrew who happened to be one of Moses' relatives. Moses looked around and, seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid the body. The next day, Moses realized that he was a wanted man, and he was even feared by the Hebrews, so he fled to Midian. Now there, through a series of events, he found his wife Zipporah, and he worked as a shepherd for Zipporah's father. In the meantime, back in Egypt, the Hebrews were growing out under their slavery for the Egyptians, and God heard their cries. So one day, about 80 years after the fact, Moses was out keeping his father-in-law's sheep, and he saw a burning bush. And this was a bush that was not being destroyed, though it was burning and on fire. His curiosity got the better of him, so he went over to look at it. Now, we don't know if the fire was lit specifically for Moses, or if other people had passed it by and only Moses had the holy curiosity to look at it. But God called Moses from that bush. Then God reveals that God has heard the prayers of the people suffering, and God has a plan to deliver them. These words and actions by God have been the hope and the promise of all people enslaved for all generations. The words of our songs today in our Spiritual Sunday reflect that. Throughout all of history, God has heard the cries for God's people. God's call for justice has been heard and answered by many people, including Moses. Let's take a look first. First and foremost, we have Jesus, who answered his Father's call to come and save the people from their sins, to save the people from their suffering by becoming human. While human, he was tried and falsely convicted as a criminal and died on the cross. And we are forgiven our sins and saved. Harriet Tubman, who's in the upper right corner, answered God's call by leading the Underground Railroad, leading people, slaves who should have stayed slaves, out of slavery and into freedom following the Underground Railroad. And then she also served as a spy during the Civil War and eventually went on to serve in the women's suffrage movement. God was with her through all of these actions, and though she was not arrested, many times she circumvented the law to save her people. And then though the Civil War freed the slaves, the people of color were still oppressed. And down in the lower left corner, we have Rosa Parks. She heard God's call. Now, she had been an activist in the civil rights movement prior to her arrest, but one day she'd had a hard day at work, and she was seated in the proper section of the bus, the section that was for coloreds. However, there was a law that if a white person came and wanted a seat, the person of color had to give it up. Well, a white person came in and wanted Rosa's seat, and she remained seated. Now, legend has it, or the story has it, that she was tired and wanted to sit. What she told people later was she was mentally tired of just being harassed by others, and she was arrested for her actions. The actions that Rosa Parks took was one of the sparks that ignited the civil rights movement. And down on the lower right corner of the screen, we have Nelson Mandela, another person who heard God's call against slavery and oppression. When apartheid was the law of the land in South Africa and people of color were regularly oppressed, Nelson Mandela was not afraid to speak out against apartheid and was arrested several times, not always convicted, but was arrested. Ultimately, he was arrested and sentenced to life in prison, which was overturned in 1990. And then he went on to become president of the country. I have named just a few people here, just a few of the many who have fought for people's rights throughout the ages. And then we have Moses. Now, because we have Moses, it doesn't mean that he was eager to answer God's call, but he did it. In our text for today, we see Moses putting up arguments against God. I kind of see this as a discussion where Moses' voice is growing louder and louder, and God's voice remains steady and calm. Kind of reminds me of when my children were little and they really wanted something, and their voices kept getting louder and louder, and I, as a parent, just remained calm on the outside. Anyhow, Moses' first argument was, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh?" To which God calmly replied, "I will be with you." In verses that we did not hear today, Moses tried other excuses, including the fact that he spoke with a stutter, but God kept insisting Moses could do it. Every excuse Moses put up, God had an answer for. Though we can see in those verses, God was getting a little tired of Moses' excuses, but that did not change God's plan to use Moses. One of Moses' biggest excuses came when he tried to say that the Israelites would not believe him. And who should he say that he'd been talking to? Here, for the first time, we hear God identify God's self when God said, "I am who I am," or as it reads in the Hebrew Bible, Esher Eah Esher. In the Hebrew scriptures, the name reads as Yahweh, which, I'm sorry. Still getting used to this. Be patient with me. Anyhow, there we go. Yahweh in all capital letters is the name of God, as the Hebrews viewed God as too sacred to fully write out his name. Yahweh is actually more of a breath. It's an exercise that I use when I'm getting ready for meditation, and I want you guys to do it with me. When we say Yah, we breathe in and we expel our breath on way. So let's try it together. Yah. I wish you could hear what I'm hearing up here. It sounds so powerful. And it's a really great tool for entering into meditation, to take the sacred name of God into prayer. In the book of John, Jesus uses a series of I am statements, including I am the good shepherd, I am the bread of life, I am the vine, you are the branches. And every time that Jesus uses the I am words, that's Jesus claiming his relationship to Yahweh. Earlier, I was talking about Jesus and Harriet Tubman and Rosa Parks, and we were talking about what they had done. And though not all of them had served time, not all of them had served time. I just figured out what I did wrong. I am so sorry about this. This was my biggest fear. Though not all of them served time in jail, they were all suffered for God's people. And thankfully, God's idea of law and order is different than ours. In God's eyes, the people who people see as trouble, as the troublemakers, the ones that are arrested, the ones that are picked on, God sees those people as liberators and calls them to serve. These people listened to God's call for them to be liberators. Among the Jewish people, Moses is remembered as the greatest prophet ever. Today, Harriet, Rosa, and Nelson are remembered as heroes of their time. Harriet Tubman almost got on a $20 bill. I think she's still in the running. Rosa Parks turned into a Barbie doll, something I never imagined when I was a child. And Nelson Mandela went on to become the president of his country and win a Nobel Peace Prize. From the beginning of time, God has heard cries of pain from God's people. God sent Jesus into the world to heal us from our sinfulness. And Jesus listened to his Father and obeyed. Because of this, all humankind is saved. Moses returned and did as God commanded, and the people believed him. In Exodus 4:31 it reads, "The people believed, and when they heard that the Lord had given heed to the Israelites, and that he had seen their misery, they bowed down and worshiped." Today we are here worshiping and bowing down before God because God saw the sinfulness and sent Jesus and grace into the world. Thanks be to God. Amen.